In the past two lessons, we've been looking at how we can use jQuery to simplify DOM manipulation. We can select elements, modify them, and add event listeners. So far, we've been looking at mouse events, moving a mouse over an element, moving it away from it, clicking it. In this lesson, we'll see what are the other types of event listeners that we can use. In the previous lessons, we've been looking at mouse events, things like the mouse over and mouse out event, clicking, etc. Other types of events include the keyboard events. These are things like pressing a key, releasing a key, etc. There are also form events. Remember, in HTML form, we can submit the form and then have event handlers. And also general window events, for instance, when the window or the browser window is opened, when it's resized, when it's scrolled, etc. So we'll start with this example of an HTML form, and we're going to use jQuery to modify the text that appears at the bottom. Remember from last week, an HTML form has a drop-down list, or what's known as a select. There are also radio buttons that allow you to only select one item, and then checkboxes where I can select more than one. And then here at the bottom is the text that we're going to dynamically generate. Currently it reads, "I'd like to buy a new animal." However, when I select, for instance, bird from the radio buttons, the text on the bottom changes to "I'd like to buy a new bird." And when I select cat, it'll change to "I'd like to buy a new cat." If I use the select box at the top or the drop-down list at the top, and I, for instance, select female, the text at the bottom reads, "I'd like to buy a new female cat." And then I can specify other attributes of the animal that I'd like to buy. For instance, I can check happy, and it will read, "I'd like to buy a new happy female cat." I can check smart. It'll add smart, so it would read, "Happy, smart female cat." Cute. And if I uncheck something, for instance, I remove smart, it just reads, "Happy, cute female cat." So this example is a little bit long, but it covers a lot of the functionality of jQuery that we would like to use. As always, we want to make sure that we include the jQuery script at the top of our HTML file in the header. In the body of the HTML, we have our form. The form allows us to combine the different input elements. Then we have the drop-down list, or the select box. Here I've given the select box the name of choose, which I'll use later, and we see the two options for male and female. Here I have the radio buttons. For a radio button, it's an input with type radio, and to indicate that these all go together, they have to have the same name. The browser will only allow us to choose one of these elements with this name. And then, of course, each element has a different value. Last, I have the checkboxes. The checkboxes could be grouped together using a name. I haven't done so in this case, but we can see that each has their own separate value. To complete the HTML, down at the bottom, I have the text or the sentence that I'm generating. I have three spans. The first span is the feature span. This is where I'm going to add things like happy, cute, smart, etc. The next span is the gender span. This is where I'll add male and female. And last, I have the species span, which I'm defaulting to animal, but will set to, for instance, dog, cat, or bird accordingly. Now we'll start looking at the JavaScript for how do I modify those three spans based on what the user has selected. So I have a comment here that indicates that we're handling the select box. That's so the user or the reader of the code knows what this code is doing. This code here is the jQuery for modifying the gender span based on what the user has selected in the select box. Let's look at it piece by piece. We'll start with the jQuery selector. In this syntax, we're going to select or choose the select elements that have the name equal choose, which is this element up here. So jQuery allows us to select elements by their type. Again, that's the select. But then if we want to specify specific ones based on some attributes, we can do so using this notation. And we're choosing the select boxes or the select elements that have name equal choose. Change is the event that will, of course, invoke some method when this select box is changed. So this is how we can run some code when the user chooses male to selects male instead of female, etc. The event handler, or the callback function, is this function that I'm defining here. It's going to use jQuery to select the element with the ID gender span. That's this span right up here. And it's going to set its HTML to this element's value. Remember, this element is the select box, so it will be set to male or female, and that's what value will be written to the gender span, which is this span here. Now let's see how we'll handle the radio buttons. We'll start with this jQuery selector. We're going to select the input elements that have type radio, and then have this attribute, which is name equals species. That, of course, would be the 3 radio buttons in the form above. We'll then specify the callback handler, the event handler, for the change event, where one of these radio buttons changes, and it will be this function. This line here will see if this element's property is set to checked. That is, we'll select the radio button that was changed, and we'll inspect its properties, and one of the properties is whether or not it's checked. Keep in mind that this callback function is called anytime the radio button changes. In some cases, the radio button is being selected or checked, and in some cases it's being unselected or unchecked. We want to only invoke this code if it's being checked, if it's being selected. If it is being selected, then we want to set the HTML in the species span. So we'll select the species span by its ID, that's this span up here, and we'll set its HTML using this radio button's value, which could be, for instance, dog, cat, or bird. Last, and perhaps most complicated, is the feature span, where we indicate whether it's happy, cute, etc. So we'll start with an array called allChecked, which will hold the values of all the checked checkboxes. We'll use this jQuery selector to select inputs that are of the type checkbox, and we'll bind a function to the change event. First, what we'll do is get this element's value. Then we'll see if this element has been checked. Remember, the user is able to check or uncheck any of the checkboxes, and this callback function will be called in each case because it's always called when that checkbox changes. In the case where the user has checked or selected this item, then we want to add the item to the array of all checked elements. To do that, we use the push function, which pushes this value onto or the end of the array, or adds it to the end of the array. If the user has unselected or unchecked this checkbox item, then we're going to run this code here. To remove it from the array, we need to get its index in the array. So we'll use the index of function on all checked. We'll get its index. If the index is -1, that means it wasn't in the array at all, which should never have happened, but it's worth checking. And to remove the item from the array, we'll use the splice function. The splice function says remove the elements starting at this index, and this is the number of elements to remove, so we'll just remove that one item from the array. Now we figured out whether to add this element to the array or remove it from the array. We'll clear the HTML in the feature span by selecting the feature span using its ID, and then setting the HTML to an empty string. Now we want to construct the text that should be in that span. We'll iterate over all the elements in the array. For each one, we'll append it to that feature span. And then the rest of this code is to figure out where to put the commas between the different values that we're displaying in the feature span. In some cases, we'll append a comma. Other cases, we'll just append a white space. We've seen how we can use jQuery to select elements of a form and then add callback functions when those elements change. In this last example, we'll keep looking at the use of forms with jQuery, in particular, what happens when the user clicks the button to submit the form. In this example, we have an input field, which will be a password, and a button that will validate that password when the user clicks it. If we don't enter anything into the input field and click the button, we'll see the following. First, we have this red box that appears around the input field, and then the text, please fix the following errors, that tell us the things that are wrong with it. It tells us that the password must contain a number, and the password must be at least 10 characters long. If I then enter some numbers and click Validate Password again, I don't see the error message about needing to contain numbers, but I still see the error message that the password needs to be 10 characters long. Finally, I add some more characters. It's at least 10 characters long. I click Validate Password, and now I see the text, the password is OK, with a green box around the password field. In this example, we'll start, of course, with jQuery. We need to include jQuery in our header. And we'll have some CSS as well that we've written into the head of our HTML. I have a CSS selector that will select the error text class, which I'll use to indicate that the code or the text should be red. I'll also have a class called error box, which I'll use to draw the red line around the input field when I need it. I'll also have a class called good box that I'll use to draw the green line around the box when I need it. Now here's the HTML for the form. At the top is the input field that is of type password, and then I have the span that reads, please fix the following errors. Now a few things to note about this span. First of all, we have the ID error message that we're going to use in our JavaScript to access this HTML element. It's in the class error text that we saw on the previous slide, which we used the CSS to specify that this text should be red. But most important, we have this property that the span is hidden, because when we first render the page, we don't want to show this error message. We'll only show it when we know there are actually errors. Following that is the unordered list. The first list item is the one that reads the password must contain a number. This has the ID needs number, which again we'll use in our JavaScript code to access this element. It's also in the class error text, so it should be red. And as with the previous span, this should be hidden when the page is first rendered because we don't want to see it just yet. Similarly, we have another list item. This is the at least 10 characters list item. It's also in the same class, so it will appear red, and it's also hidden. Last, we have this span that would appear below everything else. It reads the password is OK. Its ID is success message, and like all the others, it's hidden at first too. Finally, we have the button that when the user clicks it, will try to validate the password. Now let's look at the JavaScript, starting with this selector. We're going to select by type, which would be button, and with this specific property, which is the name equals submit. This is our submit button. We'll bind a function to this event when the user clicks the button, and it will be this callback function here. We'll first set a variable called password field using the jQuery selector, where we're selecting inputs that have this property name equals password. We'll get the value of that password field, the value that the user entered, and we'll set it as a variable called password. Then I have this Boolean variable is OK. We're going to use this variable to indicate whether the password is OK, whether it's valid, and we'll initialize it to true. This is the first of our two checks. If the length of the password, the number of characters in that string, is less than 10, then this password is not OK. So we'll set is OK to false, and then we have this line here, which is going to show that list item. That is, we will select the at least 10 chars element by its ID, and then we'll call the show function. Remember, initially it was hidden, but now when we call show, it will appear. As a reminder, the at least 10 chars element was this one here. Next, we'll see if the password contains a number, and we'll use a regular expression to do that. You'll recall from a previous lesson that regular expressions allow us to look in strings to see if they match patterns or contain specific substrings. Here, this is the regular expression delineated by the two forward slashes, and the \d just means any digit. The test function will return true or false depending on whether this string matches that regular expression. If it's false, that means the string does not match that regular expression, it means it doesn't contain any digits. In that case, we'll set isOK to false, because we don't know whether it was set to false by the previous check. But we know at this point, if it didn't contain a digit, it's not OK. Now we'll choose to show the needs number list item by selecting that element by its ID and calling the show function, which will show that element. As a reminder, the needs number element was the first one in our unordered list. This is how we get the unordered list to show the appropriate list items. Now we've conducted our 2 checks. Let's see which message we should show. If isOK is false, that means it failed at least one of the 2 checks. Then we'll hide the success message element, or span, and we'll show the error message span. Last, in order to get the appropriate colored box around the input field, in this case it should be red, we'll remove it from the good box class and add it to the error box class. If it wasn't already in the good box class, that's fine. There's nothing to remove. But we definitely want to add it to the error box class so that it will have the red box around it. Last, if we get here, then isOK is true. So we'll hide all of the elements in the error text class and then show the success message. Finally, we'll remove the password field from the error box class and add it to the good box class so that the green border will appear around it. You'll notice this return false at the bottom. We want to return false in this case so that submitting the form doesn't cause the page to reload. In summary, we spent the past 3 lessons looking at jQuery, a powerful library for retrieving and modifying DOM elements and adding event listeners. And we've seen how to handle different types of events from the mouse, the keyboard, and the forms. At the end of last week, we were working with static HTML. But this week, we introduced 3 important technologies that allow us to create dynamic web content. The first is JavaScript, a general-purpose programming language that we can embed into our HTML pages. The second is the DOM, the structural representation of the HTML elements that can be manipulated using JavaScript. And last, jQuery, the library that facilitates DOM manipulation and allows us to select elements and add callback functions to different events.